Um, so as we start, what is Commonwealth Canada for? First, I am from the Greater Toronto Area. It's located on the unceded traditional territories of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And these land acknowledgements, I think, are especially pertinent as we're talking about Commonwealth dividends, because what we're really looking at here is changing our relationship to land and nature and the value of the environment. And this new relationship would be one that I think would be more in keeping with First Nations principles. And so this making this such an acknowledgement more than just raising awareness. So very excited to hear about these perspectives today. We are going to hear from Brent Ranalli soon, as you all know. Very excited that Brent's here. He many years ago, the team at UBI Works and I thought of a name for a form of UBI from shared property, and we thought Commonwealth Dividends, that's what it should be called. And then there was a book called Commonwealth Dividends that had just come out literally that year that Brent wrote, and extremely well-written book, really dives deep on all the intellectual pathways one would follow on the journey from thinking about basic income towards Commonwealth concepts. So very excited to hear his talk today. Later in August, we have another speaker scheduled, Dr. Paul Kershaw from Canada's Generation Squeezed, which is a prolific nonprofit that promotes better equity across generations and better relationship with also some similar reforms is what we're going to talk about today. You can register for that now at commonwealth.ca/community call. And just a reminder, you can ask questions while we're doing this talk. We will be taking questions from Slido, not from the chat function. You can vote on questions in the Slido as well. We'll be taking questions in ranked order. So what is Commonwealth for? We're for a National Commons Fund or Commonwealth Fund, as well as a land value tax in Canada primarily that can pay us universal dividends, as well as lower the cost of living through lowering of income taxes in exchange for paying taxes on use of nature and land, as well as lowering cost of living due to removing speculation incentives that are increasing the prices of housing and things that we depend on. So that's what we're for. And why we're for it is because automation is melting wages, has been for many decades. We've seen 50 to 70% of changes in wages since 1980 are accounted for by primarily automation, as well as the creation of what people call an hourglass economy, where the middle class is shrinking and we're increasing lower income workers and higher income workers, but more people are being forced into low income work with no way out. And that's just going to get worse as artificial intelligence speeds things up. So if there's only one takeaway to have about all the automation discussion, it's often low wages for most. And the benefits of an industrial revolution don't show up until usually a whole century later. That's what happened after the previous industrial revolutions. So if we can find a way to create Commonwealth from the shared prosperity that is being created by technology that can pay dividends, I think that's the path to make this something that benefits everyone equally. As well, cost of living continues to rise. Over 40% of Canadians are spending a third or more of their income on rent. This is happening nearly at the same time, but Canada seems to have the worst of it as the price to income ratio in Canada has skyrocketed. So this is creating what I call a asset economy, not a workers economy. This is an economy an ownership economy, one that benefits those who own things, whether they control something as clear as a house that makes more money than a job, or whether they control intellectual property or oil rights or mineral rights. This is an economy that benefits those who have things more than those who work hard. And so automation will just make this worse. It already has. So what if the answer was to give everyone some ownership, an equity stake in this wealth that's being created by nature and society as a whole? So, the best way to improve capitalism is to help everyone benefit directly as an equity owner. So we differentiate a new category of wealth. We call it commonwealth. That's different from public wealth or private wealth and can coexist quite well. As income is increasingly being made by owning things. So how about we have everyone own a little of something that can complement private and public wealth, so everyone has some wealth. And it turns out that the roots of free market thinkers have known about these concepts for a while, because there is a category of income that is considered unearned. It's called economic rents. And this is, I think, the ideal source of funding for Commonwealth. And of course, I can't wait to hear from Brent's talk on that. And Commonwealth is very important as we look for solutions to today's challenges of inequality, because a lot of us are being distracted with all the attention paid to billionaires, but billionaire wealth across the world is extremely small compared to the wealth of the natural resources and control of natural resources, in particular land. So there are other ways that we can harness the power of Commonwealth to have a more equitable society. So the two policies we think will get us there is an investment fund for everyone, something that simply owns stocks and bonds, where a percent of the returns are paid out to everyone as dividends. And there are already 60 sovereign wealth funds around the world already. Most of them save citizens money through lower taxes when we feel they could be paying dividends directly, like they do in Alaska. And finally, on this topic, I think it's pretty straightforward and easy to do. I mean, Singapore and Norway, which are much smaller countries than Canada, already have funds that are the same or larger than the world's top 10 richest people in terms of net worth. It should be straightforward for a country to do, and there's many ways to do that we'll explore in the future. And the second policy is a land value tax, shift and dividend. The idea is tax land value and share that as Commonwealth. There's a variety of ways to do that, whether it's through reducing income taxes for those with the least wealth or all through dividends. This is really a matter of the politics of it, but this will reduce speculation that's driving up housing prices. And since the value of land is community created and the gains from technology and technological progress end up in land values, this is an ideal source of Commonwealth funding. And the research shows that a high enough land value tax that could affect some of the numbers up above, could lower land values by up to 75% fairly quickly, providing immediate relief in the housing market. So at Commonwealth Canada, we've just today published an update to our report. Some of you have seen it before. If you've seen it before, I have bad news. The numbers are a lot worse than they used to be, because we found some new math, some new ways of understanding the impacts of land value tax and the how it would actually lower the value of land substantially. That would actually reduce the taxable base. So we're still talking about a lot of money that could be raised through land value tax, 194 billion versus the other forms of nature in Canada. But the virtue of the idea is still there. The numbers are a little bit lower. So I encourage you to take a look if you want to get a glance at how land value tax would actually lower the cost of housing in Canada and generates an alternative revenue stream for us. So once again, in August, we'll hear from Dr. Paul Kershaw, and please ask your questions on slido.com, links in the chat. We will send a survey out near the end of this talk. Those of you who haven't filled it out before, please do. If you filled it out before, then don't worry about it. And that said, I'm very excited to hear from Brent. So I'll hand it over to you, Brent.
Well, thank you, Floyd. And thank you, Ben, for having me here. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so hopefully that should be visible. So what I'd like to do in this talk is introduce the concepts of Commonwealth and Commonwealth dividends and share some examples of how these concepts have been and can be put into practice, and talk about some considerations that may be useful when working with Commonwealth dividends. And so basically, we're going over some of the highlights from my book on this topic, which was published in 2021, as Floyd mentioned. So as an illustrative example that we can use to wrap our heads around the idea of Commonwealth dividends, I'd like to start with the Alaska Permanent Fund. So starting in the early 1980s, a portion of Alaska's annual oil revenue has been placed in an investment fund, and every year, every resident of the state gets a share of the earnings of the fund. The dividends have been generally in the range of $1,000 to $2,000 per year, and the program has been extremely popular in Alaska, and it is well loved across the political spectrum there. Among the program's effects, it significantly improves the quality of life of the poorest Alaskans, including rural and indigenous Alaskans. And it has also been recognized as a model of responsible stewardship for revenue from natural resources, with benefits including fiscal responsibility and safeguarding against corruption, in addition to making the resources work for all citizens in a tangible way. The so-called Alaska model is now well recognized as a set of good practices for oil and mineral development around the world. So what is the principle underlying the Alaska Permanent Fund that could be applied to other areas and sectors? The principle is that wealth that derives from common heritage resources like natural resources, ecosystem services, and more, and we'll talk more about what belongs in this bucket, should be shared equitably, regardless who has the legal or de facto control over those resources. And a program of Commonwealth dividends is very similar to a program of basic income in that it involves universal cash transfers, but it differs from basic income in a few key ways. So, for example, with Commonwealth dividends, the funding source is baked right in. So the whole question of how will we pay for it that comes up often in basic income discussions is sidestepped. With basic income, there's often a lot of hand-wringing about moral hazard, the concern that people who receive cash transfers will not handle the money responsibly. In fact, the overwhelming preponderance of evidence shows that people do tend to spend and save cash transfers responsibly. But again, Commonwealth dividends sidestep this concern because the cash transfer is framed as a right. You might as well ask about the moral hazard of bank account interest or stock dividends. And finally, where basic income is not always, but sometimes seen as a lefty issue, Alaska shows that the Commonwealth framing can cut across political fault lines, many Alaskans, of course, being conservative and leaning libertarian. We can talk about different classes of natural commonwealth that require different types of treatment. First off, we have our non-renewable resources like fossil fuels and minerals. Alaska shows the way here. When we draw down a non-renewable resource, sustainability requires converting that natural capital into some other form of capital that can produce dividends indefinitely. Sovereign wealth funds, which typically are capitalized from oil or mineral revenues, do meet these requirements, and there have been proposals to convert sovereign wealth funds into dividend-paying funds like Alaska's. Next, we have renewable resources like forests and fisheries. The first order of business is to manage these resources for sustainability and long-term yield. If the resource generates wealth over and above the cost of maintenance, that stream of wealth could be treated as a source of dividends. Finally, we have resources that are finite but require no maintenance, like the broadcast spectrum and orbital space for satellites in the exosphere. These resources have a lot of commercial value, and once the costs of administering them are met, the rest of that wealth would be prime candidates for distribution as dividends. So in the handful of slides that follow, we'll take a closer look at a few specific examples of natural commonwealth that could be sources of dividends. First, we have groundwater. It's sometimes said that water is the oil of the 21st century. In Maine, hundreds of millions of dollars worth of groundwater is bottled and sold annually by out-of-state companies. Efforts have been made to capture some of that wealth for Mainers with a proposed Maine Water Dividend Trust. The idea is that there would be a small tax on large-scale extraction, and the money would be partly spent on conservation and partly issued as dividends to all Maine residents. This proposal was directly inspired by the Alaska Permanent Fund. It has not yet been put into effect. It was on a referendum ballot 2 times so far. Deep sea minerals are another example. The deep seabed is an as yet largely untapped source of minerals, including cobalt, manganese, nickel, and rare earth elements that are used in products like smartphones, solar cells, and electric vehicles. Activities on the ocean floor are regulated by the International Seabed Authority. Commercial exploration of the deep seabed has already begun under ISA contracts, and ISA is under a lot of pressure to start authorizing commercial exploitation as well, as this sector could be worth up to $1 trillion annually. Ideally, if and when exploitation does begin, the contracts should be structured in such a way that the value of the minerals is fully captured by ISA and placed in a trust to benefit all citizens in future generations. It is not clear that ISA is on board with the idea yet, but there are groups pushing for it, including The Future We Need, this logo I've put up here, doing great work. There's potentially a very narrow window of time on this. So deep sea minerals is one of the most important areas for Commonwealth sharing advocacy in the near future, I would say. So now we come to land. Land was the subject of the very first Commonwealth dividend proposal made by Thomas Paine in 1797. And land is also the resource at the center of an even more ambitious and famous proposal by Henry George, who called for a land tax to fund government. George's book was a bestseller in the late 1800s, and his ideas had a very wide following, as I'm sure many on this call know. Under a hybrid system that takes the best ideas of Paine and George, land, but not buildings or other improvements, would be taxed up to its full rental value. This would eliminate incentives for speculation in land and hoarding of land. It would foster the most economic and efficient uses of land. It would spur economic growth by reducing rents, and it would raise a lot of money that could be spent on public priorities or distributed as dividends. Land could support very generous Commonwealth dividends, but it isn't necessarily a very practical way to raise the funds for a dividend. So it's a lot easier when you're starting from scratch, like with a newly discovered oil field on Alaska's North Slope or with minerals in deep seabeds. We typically already tax land as part of property taxes that cover both land and buildings, and those funds already go to designated uses. I'm not sure exactly how similar the Canadian and US contexts are, but in the US, where I'm based, these taxes are used to fund local services, including education, which is a big budget item for local budgets. So you could do a lot of good for the economy and the environment by raising a tax on land and reducing the tax rate on buildings. But land isn't necessarily a great place to start if your goal is to generate cash dividends, unless you're ready to re-engineer how local government is funded. Next, we have the broadcast spectrum. So there's a large but finite range of the broadcast spectrum, roughly from 3 kilohertz to 300 gigahertz, that is suitable for transmitting radio, television, and cell phone signals. Over the past century, demand for broadcast spectrum has increased at exponential rates, and at the same time, we have been finding ways to use it more efficiently and compactly. At present, large communications companies, broadcasters, as well as cell service providers, pay large premiums at auction for prime areas of bandwidth. Over 200 billion US dollars have been raised worldwide so far in spectrum auctions. Currently, that money goes into general government coffers. It could and arguably should instead be distributed as dividends. And next we have carbon permits. So we know that the atmosphere has a limited capacity as a waste sink for carbon before dangerous levels are reached. The best way to manage that scarcity is to set a cap on carbon emissions, a declining annual cap, and to auction permits each year to energy companies that wish to introduce fossil fuels into the economy within that cap. The money raised by the auction could be used for public climate priorities, but a strong case can also be made that the money should be issued to the public as dividends. So in the first place, dividends can be expected to build and maintain public support for the program in the same way that the permanent fund is very popular in Alaska. In the second place, dividends will in fact be necessary for poor and middle income households to weather higher energy prices during the decarbonization transition. And without dividends, carbon pricing is a regressive wealth transfer from the poor to the wealthy, while with dividends, a carbon pricing program is progressive. Today, around the world, there are over 60 carbon pricing programs covering over 20% of global greenhouse gas emissions. This is a good start, and we're learning a lot from the experience of these programs. But the sad fact is that very few of these programs raise carbon prices to anything like as high as they will need to be to meet global emissions targets. Today, less than 10% of the revenue raised by these programs is refunded to households. As carbon pricing programs become more ambitious, I would argue that they will need to issue more of their revenue as dividends. Carbon pricing is another urgent area, I would say, for Commonwealth sharing advocacy in the near term, and arguably the most important in the mid to long term, as it could make or break a viable climate change mitigation policy. The idea of Commonwealth dividends can be extended beyond natural commons in two directions, somewhat overlapping. So we can make use of the concept of economic rent, and we can also look to what we might call social commons. So to talk about rent first, so rent can be defined as unearned income or as compensation beyond that necessary to keep a factor of production active in the market. In the analysis on the right, which uses 8 years of data from the mining sector in Goa, India, we see an example of the extent of rent taking in the mineral sector. The numbers are scaled, so the value of the mineral is set at 100, but for convenience, we could assume, we could say this is in millions of dollars. So the mining company takes in revenue of 170 million. Of that, 60 million covers labor and other costs. Another 10 million is what we would call normal profit. So this is fair compensation for risk taking, or the rate of profit that can be expected to keep the company operating in this business space. The entire remainder, 100 million, more than half of the revenue, represents the value of the mineral itself. This 100 million is value that was not created by the mining company and to which the company has no valid moral claim. It belongs to the public and should be held in trust for all citizens and future generations. But normal practice is for the mining company to be allowed to keep it, or almost all of it. In this case, the government of Goa or India charged the company 5% in royalties or severance, and the remaining 95% went to company shareholders. So the right thing to do here is to maximize the severance tax and capture all of the unearned income for the benefit of the public. Rent can be, so this is just one example, rent can be present in a lot of different sectors of the economy due to lack of competitive markets and other factors, and there can be smart ways of extracting rent to fund dividends. Examples would include a windfall profits tax on companies and industries that persistently take in absurd levels of earnings. Also transaction fees designed to dampen financial speculation. So now let's turn to social commonwealth. So one way to generate universal public dividends from social commonwealth would be to require that enterprises that benefit from public investment and publicly funded research must issue some of their ownership shares to a dividend issuing public trust. You could also have direct public initiatives. One example currently in operation is a wind farm that was installed in Sherman County, Oregon in the early 2000s. Since the wind farm dominates the landscape, the county decided that every household in the county should get $600 annually out of the wind farm's public revenue. This Commonwealth dividend project was also inspired directly by the Alaska Permanent Fund. There's also the idea of the data dividend. So if companies monetize their customers' data for profit, maybe the customers deserve a share of the profit. Monetary and fiscal policy could be another source of dividends. So after the big bank bailouts in 2008, a lot of people asked why, if it was important to inject liquidity into the economy, governments didn't issue money directly to people. In the coronavirus pandemic, we saw that it is in fact feasible for governments to issue stimulus checks directly to households. There have been serious and thoughtful proposals like this book by Robert Hockett and Aaron James to make monetary and fiscal policy the basis for issuing new money directly to households. With almost any of these projects and proposals, there is the question of direct cash payments versus social spending. So a case could be made for balance. We want to give people the flexibility and autonomy of direct cash payments, but we also need to keep in mind that direct payments are a poor substitute for social goods like a functioning healthcare system and pension system. So a dividend initiative should not be used as an excuse to defund or dismantle social spending programs. But governments have a lot of ways of obtaining funding, from taxation to bond issuance, and there are comparably very few sources of Commonwealth dividends that could be directed to the public. And if Commonwealth revenue is diverted from households to fund government, the result will often be regressive. In addition, on our very first slide, we talked about how the Alaska model helps reduce corruption and promotes economic efficiency. This concerns the phenomenon known as the resource curse. It is well known in development economics that resource-rich nations tend to develop authoritarian regimes and sluggish economies. Essentially, the explanation is that when a government has an independent source of income, like oil or minerals, it can afford to let go of fiscal discipline and to ignore the needs of its citizens. Conversely, when a government is dependent for funding on taxing its citizens, that's a situation that fosters accountability and fiscal discipline. So when a nation or a state like Alaska does have mineral wealth, the best thing it can do is to make sure that the public rental income stays out of the government's coffers. Put it in a trust, issue dividends to citizens, and make the government go to the citizens to collect the money it needs for its operations. If we ask how to institutionalize Commonwealth dividends, the sweet spot is usually a semi-public institution. The Alaska Permanent Fund Corporation, for example, is an independent agency chartered by the Alaska legislature. Peter Barnes makes a good case that trusts are the best institutional form to manage common resources and administer dividends. Trusts are accountable not to political pressures, but to mission statements, and the court system can ensure that trusts stay true to their mission. Barnes also argues that once we build the pipes for gathering and issuing dividends from one source, Commonwealth revenue from other sources can easily be funneled through them. So if we set up a national carbon dividend program, for example, national data dividend could easily piggyback on that infrastructure. And of course, this kind of program could be organized at practically any scale, from local, like a county wind farm, right up through global, like a potential seabed minerals trust. The right scale may depend on circumstances and opportunities, as well as depending on the nature of the resource. If people are interested in studying Commonwealth dividends and advocating for Commonwealth dividends, one good way to get started is to explore the dividend potential of your particular state or country or province or region. The three examples shown here are studies conducted in Vermont, Australia, and Canada. The last one was conducted by our very own host here at Commonwealth Canada. So I'll stop there, and I'd be glad to discuss further with Lloyd and answer questions.
Okay, thank you, Brent. We'll do a few questions back and forth. I prepared for you, and meanwhile, everyone else, please add to the Slido, and after a few minutes, we'll get into the questions submitted by the community, and feel free to vote them up and down for the rank ordering. Great. So yeah, Brent, I had an emotional journey into this space to become a little obsessed with Commonwealth dividends. I'd like to hear what got you into exploring this to the point of writing that book and doing all that research.
That's a great question. So when I was a student, I don't remember how I came across this book, but I came across a book by a man named Alfred Anderson, who was a political scientist, fairly obscure, but he raised this topic, and it was like a light bulb switching on. I was like, yes, that makes a lot of sense. There are things that really should be shared that aren't being shared, and at the time, I thought that this is just a pie in the sky idea that would never actually get anywhere in the real world of politics and economics. But then maybe 15 years later, I became aware of the movement for a guaranteed basic income. And I thought, well, that's half of it right there. And I became aware that some people working on basic income were looking at the ideas specifically promoted by Thomas Paine and others of looking specifically at natural resources and ecosystem services. And so I started diving more deeply into it as a historian and a policy researcher. So by day, I work in public policy, mostly in environmental policy, and I have some training in history, and I do some writing in history on the side. So it was a good fit for me to take on this research project that turned into this book. And part of the reason for writing the book, people who have written books here know probably that unless it's a bestseller, you're not. It's not a profit-making venture to write a book. It's the book is a calling card, and it was a way to put out there the fact that I've developed some expertise in this topic, and I'd be happy to talk to people about it. And so it was perfect that Floyd picked up the book, and so I was able to. I have been able to share my expertise with Floyd and his team and other members of the community here, as well as others in other parts of the world. Yeah, I think that basically answers the question.
Thank you. Yeah, and for me, it was a journey through basic income where I felt like intuitively that there must be a source of funding that we have a moral claim to, and that there must be a way that we can reach Keynes's vision of a 20-hour work weeks in the face of automation. And if we all had a share of something growing in value because of automation, then that's the way there. And I think Keynes knew that, because there's a lot of hints about that in his essay. So Commonwealth and Commonwealth dividends seems to be the path forward. Even in his essay, he hinted that there is some element of an income support from it that comes from wealth. and not comes from redistribution, but comes from some sort of property.
For
And
sure.
so someone has to make these ideas more known. So I'm really appreciating you having that book.
And I like what you said in your first comment in the chat about not only Keynes's vision, but Star Trek like future. Because I mean, I think that Star Trek is a great way of visualizing, well, what kind of a society what would an economy look like, an economy of abundance, when when automation and robots are doing so much of the work that today occupies so many of our work weeks. And it is now becoming technologically possible for us to move into an economy where we have more leisure, and we can devote ourselves to higher pursuits. And a lot of people in the basic income area share that vision, or are trying to promote that vision. And looking specifically at commonwealth as a stepping stone to get us there, like I said in one of the early slides, it helps to sidestep some of the roadblocks that come up in conversations about basic income generally.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I mean, in a Star Trek economy, there are still market forces. People own bars. They have, some people have jobs. Some people work for Starfleet, but I don't see how we get there if we're still rivaling over basic resources needed to live, especially natural resources. And that's where the concept of economic rents was a real light bulb for me. That yeah, you can drive a profit from things that are potentially are extractive or productive, but to a point. The rest of it belongs to everyone else because it came from nature, and we didn't put that oil there, and we didn't create the land. That seemed to have a moral consistency for me that made a lot of sense. So what's a simple way you would tell someone that they deserve a share of our common wealth? I've really struggled with this one. Curious how you've worked on that.
Well, what I find is that often I go back to the Alaska Permanent Fund example, as I did in this presentation, as a way of jumping into the topic of saying, so this is something that it's a real world example. It's something that people can relate to. Well, it's a good question. I don't know if I necessarily have a great answer to it, but I feel like that's where I tend to start to point to this this real world example.
All right, that's fine. How do you see a country one day pursuing Commonwealth dividends in terms of the actual political or electoral challenges for rolling something like this out? And do you see it as being something that there'd be an umbrella Commonwealth dividend from all these sources, or like 100 different types of dividends that come from these different sources, for instance?
That is also a great question. And I think I see approaching it from a few angles. So one is that, I guess, again, if we look at Alaska, there are some great resources available talking about the political struggle to create the Alaska Permanent Fund, and some of these apply to other resources. So one thing that I mentioned during the presentation is it's easier to start with a newly discovered resource, or a resource that's newly coming online, than something that is already spoken for. That was true of Alaska's oil field in the 1970s. It's true of deep seabed minerals today. To a certain extent, it's true of carbon auction revenues. There was a combination of popular support from below, and the prospect of dividends helped to generate the popular support that the architects of the Alaska Permanent Fund policy needed in order to pass it into law. But I think that can be overstated. People who advocate for carbon dividends today often put the attractiveness of dividends to households right at the top of their list of reasons why we should be, why people will get on board with dividends. In the US, where I am, what we see is that the prospect of dividends, it won't move someone if they're already in a political space where they're defined as part of this camp that opposes action on climate policy. There's also, and I think this is something that basic income advocates struggle with, there's also a tendency to to say, well, as part of the the rugged individualist work ethic that's true in the United States and I'm sure true in other nations as well, that we don't want handouts, and it's possible to frame a basic income as a handout. I think it's easier to overcome that in the case of Commonwealth dividends. You can say, no, this isn't a handout. This is a right. This belongs to you. But carbon dividend advocates still struggle with this. So I think that you can do, there's a certain amount that can be done to build political support for it. But ultimately, I think that if these policies happen, they will need, it'll need sustained work from political insiders, from people who, so if you look at, for example, the broadcast spectrum, we went from a place where broadcast spectrum was basically handed out for free to corporations to a place now where technocrats basically said, well, and in collaboration and conversation with politicians who passed the laws, said, well, really the users of the broadcast spectrum should be paying for this valuable limited resource. And now it's normal for the broadcast spectrum to be auctioned off. So then the next step in that evolution would be to say, well, that income right now it's going into general government coffers. Really, it should be going to people, and we're not yet at the place where we're ready to move that forward. But I could more easily see a top-down approach to somebody saying, this is something that we ought to do. Let's find a way to make it happen, than for there to be a groundswell of public opinion for it. Those are some thoughts anyway.
Yeah, thank you. And in Canada, we have a robust and increasing carbon tax, and it was never communicated as dividends, but reimbursement was part of the narrative from the beginning. So there's a carbon rebate program that I believe 8 out of 10 households are better off after the rebates. So it's seen as a compensatory thing, so that no one's worse off except the polluters primarily, or those who use the most, as opposed to a dividend approach. And I just looked at my bank the other day and I saw that I'll have $500 this year in carbon rebate, which I suppose is a Commonwealth dividend. And yes. Maybe I spend more than that on gas right now. I'm not sure. But yeah, so it has happened in some parts of the world.
I think once a policy like this is in place, then, and I think we'll see this. I talked about just now about political opposition, even from people who would benefit from a policy like that in the United States. I think the experience we've seen in other nations is that, or in Alaska as an example, as a state, when these policies are put in place, you develop a constituency. People do recognize, oh, this is a right. This is something that belongs to me. So I think constituencies can develop for these things.
Okay. And what will be different in a world that already had Commonwealth dividends versus today? If you project a crystal ball in the future and the vision of your book's been realized, what's different?
What's different? Well, and so here we get the vision that I think we share with basic income advocates. So it's a future where people have more freedom in their careers to take risks and to pursue opportunities that they would like to pursue, to take entrepreneurial risks, freedom to step back from gainful employment, so marginally more freedom than they have now, to engage in volunteer work, to care for family members. It's a world with more personal freedom and opportunity. Wonderful.
Thanks, Brent. So let's head over to the, I'll ask questions from the Slido that were submitted by the audience. I see David put a question in chat. I'll add that to the Slido. Everyone feel free to vote questions up as you like, and just putting the link back in. So the first question is, one moment. Most voted. Can you comment on the difference or trade-offs between the Alaska Permanent Fund and the Norway Oil Fund models of financing dividends versus public investment?
Sure. So I guess the key distinction here, so there are several things that are different, but I think the key one is that the Alaska Permanent Fund devotes some of the investment income, a large portion of the investment income, to universal equal dividends for state residents, whereas the Norway Oil Fund, like most sovereign wealth funds, is the income that's used is directed towards public priorities, public spending. I think the slide here, I can even pull back to it. So I think this. Oh, I'm not sharing anymore, am I?
No, you're not sharing anymore.
Well, that's all right. But so the slide I had earlier on dividends versus social spending speaks to this. I think one of the key benefits of dividends is it builds a constituency. Another is that it is an antidote for the resource curse. So if you're directing your oil revenue into a sovereign wealth fund that's managed by experts, technocrats outside the political process, you're going a considerable way towards getting rid of the resource curse. But still, if the earnings of that fund are then going into the government coffers to fund operating expenses, you are going to be susceptible to potentially to wasteful spending, concerns about potential corruption. I'm not saying that there's Norway has a corruption problem, but I'm saying that these are the tendencies that you avoid if you direct the money to people and have the government tax people to get its operating income.
All right. I love the idea of Canada putting the EM spectrum auction rents back in people's pockets instead of it being general revenues. Next question is, how could rents from tech platform giants be understood and collected as a policy?
I think we could say there are two basic approaches. So one would be to require the tech platform giants to issue dividends to their users on the premise that they are profiting from the use of their users' data. Another would be a tax model where you could say that because of the use of users' data and data in general, so data-intensive companies and industries might be susceptible to a tax, and that tax could be redistributed by the government. I'm aware that there are proposals and possibly even partially implemented in California specifically. I'm not so up on the details that I could speak to those details, but it's definitely an area where work is being done, and in California in particular. I think California's at the forefront of that.
Awesome. And for my own research, I know that Sam Altman, who is the president of OpenAI, doing amazing work with ChatGPT, had proposed an annual share dilution tax on the companies that make over $1 billion a year. So any company that makes over $1 billion a year would have to give 2.5% of its shares into a commons fund that would pay people dividends, and that would be a way to address the returns of artificial intelligence. And yeah, and then recently came across the fact that David Green, a prominent Canadian economist, said that would also be a share on equity, so almost like a forced ownership, partial ownership by the public would be a way to share in those returns from automation. So it's quite interesting.
Those are great ideas. Yeah.
Yeah. Another question: how many political parties today are aware of the Commonwealth dividends idea?
Well, I'm in the US, so I'll speak to the US context. It's not really on the agenda of either of the main political parties in the US. There are advocates on both sides Isle. There tend to be more of them, and they tend to be more active and vocal on the left, but it's not at the place yet where it's a platform of either of the political parties.
But we're going to change that, right?
Let's do it.
Yeah. On the rents and minerals page, you mentioned a 10% return is enough to keep a company running. What is that? Does that mean that any corporate profit over 10% is unearned?
It's a great question. It's really a question for an economist or an accountant. But I think that it would be fair to say that it varies from industry to industry, what counts as a normal rate of profit. And I think 10% might be typical for many industries. But don't quote me on that, because I'm not an accountant myself, a corporate accountant.
I actually had that question because we struggle with that for our own rents paper. How do we where do we draw the line of what is rent and what isn't when it comes to the natural resources sector in particular? So I was just curious what your thoughts were on that. A question from Steve Hoskins. Is it your impression that a UBI funded by LVT would flow into higher land rents, lower them, or leave them unchanged?
Let me think about this.
And any other experts on the call, you're welcome to weigh in. I see some names here that are quite impressive on the Georges front.
So I welcome people who have greater expertise in this area, if they are on the call, to weigh in. My impression is that if you phased in and fully implemented a land value tax that would take out of landowners 100% of the rental value of their land, it would lead to it would lead to less hoarding of land. So the competition for land ownership would be decreased, and that would effectively lead to a situation where the actual transactional values of the land that's bought and sold, would be lower than it is today. I believe that's the correct answer, but again, if there are land economists out there who can give a more definitive answer, I'd welcome that.
All right. Next question. A conservative politician would say that royalties on timber, oil, minerals, etc., are already a form of commonwealth that governments are addressing. How would we respond to
that? Yes, we're collecting royalties and severance taxes, but as the example showed, that slide of the minerals in Goa, India, I think it's pretty typical that the value that's collected in severance taxes and royalties is a small fraction of the total value of the minerals and the timber and the oil. Yeah, we're not even close to, to capturing the full value. But
Brent,
yeah, please.
Sorry, that's what we're attempting to show in the paper that Commonwealth Dividend prepared, is that, well, we acknowledge fairly significant royalty regimes and rent regimes across Canada, especially in our resource sector. They're actually, in many cases, pretty strong. We're arguing that there's more, that they're still not adequate in capturing the full value of rent.
That's
or
great.
at least a significant portion of the rent, even if it's not the full value. Yeah.
And Canada may be at the forefront here, doing a better job than many other countries. And I think it's worth saying that the systems that we have in place for gathering royalties and levying severance taxes are it's great that we have those tools in place. There are mechanisms. It's just a matter of ratcheting up the numbers.
There's actually evidence that shows, at least in the mineral sector, Canada is actually behind many other countries, that we actually allow a lot of the rent to be gathered by private interests versus Canada, despite fairly significant royalty and mining rent regimes. So, yeah.
Still work to be done.
Yep.
The next question I think is foundational. Can wealth generated from what belongs to all of us include inventions that increasingly become embedded in the fabric of society? So.
This is a very good question.
Yeah.
So, if we're talking about inventions, also works of art, intellectual property, generally. So our current system is that the inventor or the creator has an exclusive right to profit from their work for a certain number of years under copyright and other programs, and then their work reverts to the public domain. I would say that that system is a pretty good system, and that in the first phase where the innovator gets the fruit of their labors, we want the innovator to get the fruit of their labors. In the second phase where it's in the public domain, in principle, it should be available to everyone who wants to make use of it, whether it's an invention or a work of literature. And if that's the case, if it's publicly available to anyone who wants to use it, then it doesn't have market value. There's no scarcity that would generate income that could be funneled into Commonwealth dividends. So I think that's the big picture. On the margins, maybe there'd be something more to be said about it. But I think that if we're looking at ways to fund Commonwealth dividends, I think that intellectual property wouldn't be high on the list, as I would draw it up anyway. But it's definitely something that's worth thinking about. Why do we have our systems for intellectual property set up the way they are?
All right. Well, that's all the questions, and we're at the hour. Anyone have any? Here's the exit survey. People would like to please take it if you haven't done it before. Yeah, Brent, any last words? And
sure. So I'd say that the topic we're talking about here, it's a frontier in economics and ecology and policy where there's a lot of work to be done. And I have been very impressed with what Floyd and his team have done in just the past few years in Canada. And I hope this talk will inspire others to dig deeper into the topic, as well as scholars and as activists.
Thank you very much. And thank you for your help consulting with us and inspiring our work. And yeah, and some of those in the call, Steve Hoskins, Stefan Horn, thank you for your work. That's inspiring our work as well. And yeah, I guess I'll just leave any last options for anyone to ask a question or make a comment. So yeah, great. Thanks everyone. This video will be posted on YouTube, usually within a day or two. And the link I think will go back out on email. And yeah, this was a very a dear topic to me, as you know, we were promoting Commonwealth dividends from Commonwealth Canada's website and continuing to promote basic income generally off of UBI Works' website. And I think that the two can coexist. It's unlikely that Commonwealth dividends would be high enough to actually end poverty. So you really do need both. But I think without both, we won't see meaningful change to the underlying drivers of poverty, which is unequal ownership and control of the world's natural resources. And that's what I think Commonwealth dividends is a clean and just solution for that. So please continue to keep following our work. And thank you, Brent. And see everyone hopefully in August.
Thank you, Floyd. Thanks, Ben. And thanks everyone for participating.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.
Good.
All right. So, Brent, are you still working on this stuff now? Like, do you have you done work since the book on these ideas?
I've been in my role as a member and a trustee at FASTA. I'm not sure if we've talked about that, an Ireland-based sustainability think tank. I'm looking for opportunities to promote the work. Most of my energy these days in this area has gone into carbon dividend advocacy in the US. So trying to
much needed.
Get some action on the federal level. We're in a situation now where the Biden administration is willing to put its weight behind climate initiatives, but mostly on the spending side of things, not on the